The ad was simple and innocuous. It read, "Room for rent in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Perfect for students or professionals. Utilities included. $400 month." Below it was a single blurry photo of a small, nondescript bedroom. The price was too good to be true, but Alex didn't have the luxury of being skeptical. With eviction looming and his savings dwindling, he quickly fired off an email to the anonymous poster. Within an hour, Alex got a reply. The poster introduced themselves as Carl and mentioned that the room was still available. There was no phone number, just an address and a note. "Come by tonight after 7. If it's a fit, you can move in right away." Alex arrived at the house just after sunset. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. The house itself was old but well-maintained, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. He hesitated before knocking, feeling an inexplicable unease, but shook it off. This was his only shot. Carl opened the door almost immediately. He was older than Alex expected, maybe in his late 60s, with a hunched posture and a soft, almost apologetic demeanor. Come in, Carl said, ushering Alex inside. The house smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. "I'm glad you came." The interior was sparse, with outdated furniture and bare walls. Carl led Alex down a narrow hallway to the bedroom. It was exactly as the photo had shown, small, plain, and unremarkable. "What do you think?" Carl asked, his watery blue eyes fixed on Alex. "It's fine," Alex said. "When can I move in?" Carl's face lit up. "Tonight, if you'd like. I don't like to waste time. Let me just grab the paperwork." As Carl shuffled off, Alex noticed something strange. The hallway had 3 doors, but only 2 seemed to belong to rooms. The third door was heavy and metal, with a sliding latch and a padlock hanging loosely. He could feel cold air seeping through its edges. Before he could investigate further, Carl returned, holding a worn clipboard. "Just sign here," Carl said, handing Alex a pen. "We'll take care of the formalities later." Despite his reservations, Alex signed. Carl's excitement was palpable. "You'll sleep well here," he said, almost to himself. "Very quiet. Very private." That night, Alex lay on the creaky bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was dead silent, save for the occasional groan of the old wood settling. As he drifted off, he thought he heard something. Faint, rhythmic tapping. The next day, Alex started noticing oddities. The fridge was completely empty, despite Carl claiming to have lived there for years. None of the lights in the house had switches. They were all controlled by cords that seemed haphazardly strung along the walls. And that metal door in the hallway, it was locked now, the padlock firmly secured. Carl was nowhere to be seen. Alex spent the day exploring the town, applying for jobs, and trying to forget the growing pit of unease in his stomach. When he returned that evening, Carl was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an empty plate. "Did you hear anything last night?" Carl asked, his voice unusually sharp. "What do you mean?" Alex replied, taken aback. "Just noises. Scratching. Tapping. Anything like that?" Alex hesitated. "Maybe? I don't know. This house makes a lot of weird sounds." Carl nodded slowly, then muttered something under his breath. It sounded like it always does. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from behind the metal door. Alex's curiosity got the better of him. Grabbing his phone as a flashlight, he crept into the hallway. The door was still locked, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was on the other side. "Carl?" Alex whispered, knocking softly. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, a voice, a woman's voice, trembling and hoarse, came from behind the door. "Please, help me." Alex stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He was about to respond when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around to see Carl, his face twisted in a grimace. "You shouldn't have come here," Carl said, his voice cold and devoid of its usual frailty. Before Alex could react, Carl shoved him into the metal door, unlocking it with a key he pulled from his pocket. The door swung open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black staircase descending into the earth. The air was icy and reeked of decay. Carl pushed Alex down the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. Alex tumbled into the darkness, his phone slipping from his grasp and clattering somewhere out of reach. He scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. A faint, wet sound came from the shadows, a shuffling, dragging noise. Alex backed away, his hands searching the walls for a light switch or a weapon. His fingers brushed against something soft and cold. He turned, and his eyes adjusted just enough to make out the shapes. Dozens of figures lined the walls, their bodies emaciated, their faces pale and lifeless. They were chained, their eyes reflecting the faint glow of Alex's fallen phone. One of them moved, reaching out a skeletal hand. "Run," she whispered. But it was too late. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer, until it was all around him. Alex screamed as the figures came to life, their chains rattling, their mouths opening in silent, agonized wails. Above, the metal door slammed shut. The ad popped up late at night, tucked between posts for used furniture and job listings. Need a driver, $200 cash for one night, must have a reliable car, no questions asked, respond with your availability. Jessica read it twice. She'd just lost her job, her rent was overdue, and her car was one of the only things she had left. It sounded shady, sure, but $200 for one night of driving? It was too tempting to pass up. She fired off a quick email and got an immediate reply. "Meet me at 11 p.m. sharp at the corner of Ash and 9th. Black duffel bag. Keep the engine running. No questions. $200 guaranteed. No name. No further explanation." At 10:45 p.m., Jessica parked at the corner of Ash and 9th, the darkened streets deserted. Her stomach churned as she waited, the glow of her phone doing little to calm her nerves. She kept telling herself it was just one night. Get in, get out, and forget about it. At 11 p.m. exactly, a man appeared out of the shadows, carrying a black duffel bag just as described. He was tall and wiry, wearing a hoodie that obscured most of his face. Without a word, he slid into the passenger seat and placed the bag at his feet. "Drive," he said. Jessica's heart raced as she pulled away from the curb. "Where to?" "Head north. I'll tell you when to turn." His voice was low and gravelly, and he didn't offer any more details. The silence was suffocating. She kept glancing at the bag, wondering what could be inside. Money? Drugs? Something worse? 15 minutes into the drive, the man's phone buzzed. He picked it up and muttered something Jessica couldn't make out. Then he turned to her. "Change of plans. Take this next right." She obeyed, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The streets were becoming darker, more isolated. She passed abandoned warehouses and empty lots, her unease growing with every turn. "Stop here," he said suddenly. Jessica pulled over next to a crumbling brick building. The man grabbed the duffel bag and got out, leaving the door open. "Wait here. I won't be long." Before she could respond, he disappeared into the shadows. Jessica's eyes darted to the bag, which he'd left behind. Curiosity gnawed at her. No questions, she reminded herself. But something about the situation felt wrong. Very wrong. Minutes ticked by, and the man didn't return. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her feel like she wasn't alone. Jessica's breathing quickened as she glanced around. Then, from the rearview mirror, she saw movement. A figure was approaching the car from the darkness. It wasn't the man. This figure was hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was pale, the features distorted as if they'd been stretched too thin. It didn't seem to walk so much as lurch forward, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Jessica's instincts screamed at her to drive, but her hands were frozen on the wheel. The figure stopped a few feet from the car, tilting its head as if studying her. Then it pointed directly at the duffel bag. Her stomach dropped. Whatever was in that bag, it was what this thing wanted. The figure started to circle the car, its long, bony fingers dragging along the windows, leaving faint smears behind. Jessica fumbled for her phone, but her trembling hands dropped it onto the floor. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, the passenger door slammed shut, snapping her out of her paralysis. She looked up to see the man standing outside, staring at the figure. "Don't move," he hissed through the window. The figure stopped its circling and turned its attention to him. The air seemed to grow heavier, the temperature inside the car plummeting. The man reached into the duffel bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Jessica squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. He unwrapped the cloth, revealing what looked like a small, shriveled object. Something organic. Something wrong. The figure let out a guttural, inhuman sound, its hollow eyes burning with hunger. The man threw the object at the figure, who caught it with unnatural speed. For a moment, the air was filled with a grotesque squelching sound as the figure consumed it. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the darkness. The man got back into the car, his face unreadable. "Drive!" Jessica didn't argue. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel and sped away from the building. After several minutes of silence, she finally found the courage to speak. "What the hell was that?" "No questions," he snapped. Jessica clenched her jaw, her pulse still pounding in her ears. When they finally returned to the original meeting point, the man handed her a wad of cash. "Good job," he said, stepping out of the car. Before he walked away, he turned back. "If anyone contacts you about another driving job like this, don't take it." Jessica stared after him, the cash heavy in her hand. She didn't sleep that night, and she never, ever answered another Craigslist ad. Late one night, Mia was scrolling through Craigslist, looking for a cheap couch for her new apartment. She'd been browsing for hours when she found a listing that made her pause. "Free couch. Need gone tonight. Must pick up by midnight. Great condition, clean, slightly used. Address will be sent after confirmation." The photo showed a plush, dark green couch. It looked perfect, better than anything she could afford. And free was a deal she couldn't pass up. She emailed the poster immediately. Minutes later, she received a reply. Address 342 Sycamore Drive. Come alone. The request to come alone felt odd, but Mia chalked it up to the usual internet weirdness. Maybe it was just someone nervous about strangers showing up. Besides, it was late, and she really wanted that couch. At 11:15 p.m., she pulled up to 342 Sycamore Drive. The house was decrepit, standing in the middle of a lot overrun with weeds. The porch light flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the sagging front steps. Mia hesitated. The house looked abandoned, but her phone buzzed with another email. "Come inside. Couch is in the living room. Doors unlocked." Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but curiosity won out. She convinced herself the poster was just being cautious about leaving a valuable item outside. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped onto the creaking porch. The door swung open with a faint groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. The living room was dark, save for a faint glow from the far corner. There it was, the couch. It was even better in person. Rich, velvety fabric, no visible stains, and surprisingly modern compared to the rest of the house. Mia approached it cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. That's when she noticed the scratches. Deep gouges ran along the back of the couch, as though something with claws had tried to dig into it. She ran her fingers over them, a chill creeping down her spine. Then she noticed something else. The couch wasn't resting on the floor. It was hovering. Mia blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. She crouched down, shining the flashlight underneath. The couch was about an inch off the ground, floating silently. "What the hell?" she whispered. A noise broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere upstairs. Mia froze, her heart pounding. She stood up slowly, her ears straining to pinpoint the sound. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, the couch moved. It slid toward her, slowly at first, then faster, as though something invisible was pushing it. Mia stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the empty house. The couch halted abruptly, inches from her legs. Then, as if on command, it flipped onto its back, revealing the underside. Her stomach churned. The fabric on the bottom was torn, exposing something inside. Not stuffing, not springs, something wet and pulsing. It looked like flesh, veined and alive, writhing as though it were breathing. A low, guttural growl echoed through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Mia bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She pulled at the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the growl grew louder, vibrating through her bones. She turned just in time to see the couch rise into the air, its cushions splitting open like a gaping mouth lined with jagged bone-like teeth. Mia screamed as the thing lunged toward her, swallowing the room in darkness. The next day, a new listing appeared on Craigslist. "Free couch. Must pick up tonight. Great condition. Slightly used. Address will be sent after confirmation." The ad was short and strange. Help needed. Night shift. $300 for 6 hours. Easy work. No experience needed. Must have a phone. Email if interested. Riley was broke and desperate, so she sent an email. Within minutes, a reply came with the address and instructions. "Come to 721 Holloway Road. Be there by 10:30 p.m. The job is simple. Watch the monitors and follow the rules. No exceptions." The lack of detail was unsettling, but $300 for 6 hours? She couldn't say no. Riley arrived at 721 Holloway Road at 10:20 p.m. The building was nondescript, an old brick structure with no signs, tucked behind a row of warehouses. Inside, the air was cold and the walls smelled faintly of bleach. A man in his 40s met her in the lobby, his face gaunt and eyes sunken. "You're here for the job?" he asked without introducing himself. Riley nodded. "Follow me." He led her down a narrow hallway to a room filled with monitors. The screens displayed live footage from what looked like a large, decrepit house. Empty hallways, darkened staircases, dusty rooms. The man gestured to a chair in front of the monitors. "Your job is to watch. Take notes if you see anything unusual, but follow the rules." He handed her a laminated sheet with a list of rules. 1. Do not leave the room until 4:30 a.m., no matter what you hear. 2. Do not answer the phone if it rings. 3. If the screen goes black, do not look away. Wait until it comes back on. 4. If you see someone on the monitors, write down the time and screen number, but do not react. Riley stared at the list, her unease growing. "What is this place?" she asked. The man didn't answer. He glanced at his watch, muttered, "Good luck," and left without another word. At exactly 10:30, the monitors flickered. Riley took a deep breath and settled into the chair. The first hour was uneventful, just empty hallways and dark, still rooms. But at 11:45, one of the screens changed. A figure appeared at the edge of the frame, a man in a dark suit standing perfectly still at the end of a hallway. Riley's stomach tightened. She grabbed her notebook and jotted down the time and screen number. 11:45, screen 6. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the wall. After a few minutes, the screen flickered, and he was gone. By 12:30, more figures began to appear. On screen 3, a woman in a white dress sat in the middle of a room, her back to the camera. On screen 9, a child stood at the top of a staircase, his face obscured by shadows. Riley wrote each one down, her hands trembling. Then the phone rang. The sound shattered the silence, making her jump. It was an old rotary phone, sitting on the desk beside her. She stared at it, the laminated rules flashing in her mind. Do not answer the phone. The ringing stopped after a few seconds, but the silence felt heavier now. At 1:15, one of the monitors went black. Screen 8. Riley froze, the rule about black screens looping in her head. Do not look away. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark screen, her pulse pounding in her ears. After what felt like an eternity, the screen flickered back on. The hallway it displayed was empty, but now there was a message written on the wall in red. "Stop watching." Riley's breath hitched. She glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. 2 more hours. At 3:30, the figures on the screens began to move. The woman in the white dress turned her head slowly, her face pale and featureless. The child at the staircase started walking down, his footsteps echoing faintly through the speakers. Then, one by one, they began to look directly into the cameras. Riley's panic rose as every figure turned to face her, their empty eyes boring into hers through the monitors. She wanted to run, but the rule echoed in her head, do not leave the room. At 4, the figures started disappearing, screen by screen. By 4:15, the monitors showed nothing but empty rooms again. At 4:30, the man from earlier returned. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply handed her an envelope of cash and said, "You did well." Riley wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She grabbed the envelope and left, vowing never to return. When she got home, she noticed something on her shirt, a small red stain, like a fingerprint. She scrubbed at it, but it wouldn't come off. The next night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed with an email. It was from the same address as the job posting. "Thank you for your help. We'll be in touch." Riley deleted the email, but she couldn't shake the feeling she was still being watched. The Craigslist ad read, "Urgent, moving help needed. $500 for 2 hours of work. Tonight only. Cash paid immediately. Reply for address." Jack couldn't believe his luck. Struggling to make rent, $500 was a godsend. He quickly emailed the poster and received a reply moments later. "Come to 1426 Maplewood Lane. Be here by 10 p.m. sharp. No late arrivals. Knock twice when you get here." The message was curt, but Jack didn't care. He grabbed his car keys and set off, eager to earn some easy cash. When he arrived, Maplewood Lane was nearly deserted, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. The house at 1426 was old, its paint peeling, windows dark, and front yard overgrown. Jack parked on the curb, suddenly feeling uneasy. "Just 2 hours," he muttered to himself, stepping out of the car. He approached the door and knocked twice as instructed. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and a middle-aged man peered out. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken. "You're here for the job," the man said, more a statement than a question. Jack nodded. "Good, come in." The interior of the house was worse than the outside. The air was stale, and the faint smell of damp rot hung in the air. The walls were bare, the floorboards creaking under Jack's feet. The man led him into the living room, where several large wooden crates sat stacked against the walls. "Your job is simple," the man said, gesturing to the crates. "Take these down to the basement. Be careful. They're fragile. Don't open them, and don't ask questions." Jack frowned. "The basement? Are the stairs sturdy enough for this?" The man's expression darkened. "The stairs are fine. Just do the job, and you'll get your money." Jack shrugged. He wasn't about to argue for $500. He approached the first crate, testing its weight. It was lighter than he expected, but when he tilted it slightly, something inside shifted, making a soft, wet sound. He froze, the hair on his neck standing on end. "Problem?" the man asked, his tone sharp. "No," Jack said quickly. "No problem." He carried the first crate to the basement door. When he opened it, a wave of cold air hit him, carrying with it an earthy, metallic smell. The staircase was steep and narrow, the light from above barely illuminating the space below. Jack descended slowly, the crate balanced in his arms. At the bottom, he found himself in a large, unfinished basement. The walls were stone, and the floor was dirt. In the center of the room stood a single metal table, its surface rusted and stained. Shaking off his discomfort, Jack set the crate down and hurried back upstairs for the next one. As he carried the second crate down, he thought he heard something, a faint scratching sound coming from the far corner of the basement. He paused on the stairs, straining his ears, but the sound stopped. "Just your imagination," he muttered, forcing himself to continue. By the time he brought down the third crate, the scratching had grown louder, more deliberate. It was coming from inside one of the crates he had already placed. Jack's curiosity got the better of him. Kneeling beside the crate, he pressed his ear against it. "Help me," a faint voice whispered from within. Jack recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. "No questions," he reminded himself, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Please, let me out." Jack stumbled back, his breath quickening. He ran up the stairs, determined to confront the man. When he reached the living room, the man was gone. The house was silent, except for a faint creaking sound. Jack turned and saw the door to the basement slowly closing on its own. "Hey!" he shouted, rushing toward it. The door slammed shut just as he reached it, the force nearly knocking him off his feet. He grabbed the handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. From behind the door, the voice came again, now joined by others. Dozens of voices, crying, screaming, begging for help. "Let us out! Don't leave us here!" The air grew colder, and Jack felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly and saw the man standing in the hallway, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You opened a door you shouldn't have," the man said, his voice distorted as if layered with something inhuman. Jack backed away, his legs trembling. "What the hell is in those crates?" The man stepped closer, his eyes now black voids. "You should have followed the rules." The lights flickered, and the voices from the basement grew louder, more desperate. Before Jack could react, the floor beneath him gave way, and he plunged into darkness. When he woke up, he was lying in the basement, surrounded by the crates. They were open now, their contents spilled onto the dirt floor, scraps of clothing, pieces of broken bones, and human teeth. The voices were gone, replaced by silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a twisted, unnatural shape with too many limbs and glowing eyes. Jack screamed as it crawled toward him, its mouth opening impossibly wide. Above, the man's voice echoed down the stairs. "Welcome to the collection." The Craigslist ad was bizarre but intriguing. Rush room for rent, $100 a month, all utilities included, quiet neighborhood, ideal for those who enjoy privacy. Lila had been living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to afford her tiny, noisy apartment. The idea of a quiet place for just $100 a month seemed too good to be true, but desperation made her respond. The reply came quickly. "Come by tonight to see the room. 317 Hemlock Road, knock twice. Wait for 10 seconds, then knock once more." That evening, Lila arrived at 317 Hemlock Road. The house stood at the end of a dead-end street, partially obscured by overgrown trees. Its windows were dark, and the porch light flickered faintly. She hesitated, but eventually followed the instructions. 2 knocks, a pause, and one final knock. The door creaked open, and a tall, thin man stood in the doorway. He had a gaunt face, his pale skin almost translucent in the dim light. "You're here for the room," he said, his voice soft and slow. Lila nodded. "Yes. Is it still available?" "Follow me." The man led her inside without another word. The interior of the house was sparsely furnished, and a faint, musty smell lingered in the air. He took her down a narrow hallway to a door at the end. "This is it," he said, opening the door. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a single window covered by heavy curtains. "All I ask is that you follow the house rules," the man said, handing her a piece of paper. The rules were handwritten and simple. 1. Do not leave your room after midnight. 2. Do not open the door if you hear knocking. 3. If you hear whispers, ignore them. 4. Do not look outside the window between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. Lila laughed nervously. "Are these really necessary?" The man's expression didn't change. "If you want to stay here, you must follow the rules." The rent was cheap and the room seemed fine. She agreed. That night, as Lila lay in bed, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling the house gave her. At 11:55 p.m., she glanced at the clock and remembered the rules. "Do not leave your room after midnight," she muttered to herself with a scoff. Easy enough. She turned off the light and tried to sleep. At exactly 12:15 a.m., a soft knock came at her door. Knock, knock, knock. Her heart raced as she remembered the second rule. The knocks came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, a woman's voice, pleading. "Please, help me. I'm lost." Lila froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Please," the voice repeated, closer now. "I'm so cold. Let me in." She gripped the blanket tightly, resisting the urge to respond. The voice grew desperate, its tone shifting into something deeper, more guttural. "You can't ignore me forever," it snarled. The knocking stopped, but then came a faint scratching sound like nails dragging across the wood. It circled the room, moving from the door to the walls. And then the whispering began. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in a language Lila couldn't understand. They were soft at first, but grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like they were inside her head. She squeezed her eyes shut, kept repeating to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." Hours passed. The voices faded, and the room grew eerily silent. At 3 a.m., curiosity got the better of her. She approached the window, her hands trembling. Pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside, she saw nothing. The yard was empty. The street was still. Relieved, she let out a shaky breath and turned back to the bed. That's when she saw the shadow in the corner of the room. It wasn't there before. It was tall and thin, its shape barely distinguishable from the darkness around it, but she could feel its eyes on her. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't move, but the air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. Suddenly, it darted toward her, faster than she could react. Lila screamed, but everything went black. When she woke up, it was morning. The room looked normal, the sunlight streaming through the window. She bolted out of the house, not even bothering to take her belongings. Later, she tried to find information about the house, but there was no listing for 317 Hemlock Road. It didn't exist. Weeks passed, and she tried to forget the experience. But one night, as she lay in her new apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email. "Sir, room for rent, $100 a month. All utilities included. Quiet neighborhood. Ideal for those who enjoy privacy." The Craigslist ad was simple. Photographer wanted. Night shoot. Must be okay with abandoned locations. 1,000 cash for 3 hours. Evan, an amateur photographer trying to build his portfolio, jumped at the opportunity. The pay was too good to pass up, and he loved eerie, abandoned places. It was his favorite aesthetic. He responded to the ad and received an immediate reply. "Meet at Hawthorne Asylum. Midnight. Bring your best camera gear." The Hawthorne Asylum had been abandoned for decades. It was infamous for the mysterious disappearances of several patients before its closure in the 1970s. Locals whispered about strange lights and sounds coming from the property, but Evan dismissed the stories as urban legends. That night, he arrived at the asylum just before midnight. The building loomed against the night sky, its windows shattered, its facade cracked and overgrown with ivy. A single light flickered at the entrance, where a man in a long black coat was waiting. "You're Evan?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Evan nodded. "Yeah, You're the client? The man didn't answer. Instead, he handed Evan a manila envelope. Inside was a map of the asylum with several rooms marked with red X's. These are the spots, the man said. Take one photo in each room. No flash, no edits, just raw images. Be done by 3 a.m. Got it, Evan said, masking his unease. What are the photos for? The man smiled faintly, his teeth unnaturally white against his pale skin. Just documentation. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Evan shrugged off his discomfort, adjusted his gear, and stepped into the asylum. The air inside was damp and heavy, the smell of mildew overwhelming. His footsteps echoed in the empty halls as he followed the map to the first marked room, a former patient dormitory. The room was eerily pristine, as though untouched by time. The beds were made, the floor swept clean. Evan took the shot and moved on. The second room was different. It was a therapy room, with a single chair in the center surrounded by shattered glass. As Evan framed the shot, he thought he saw movement in the broken mirror on the wall. He lowered the camera and looked around, but the room was empty. Just nerves, he muttered, and took the photo. In the third room, a faint whisper reached his ears. Leave. Evan froze, his heart racing. He swung his flashlight around the room, illuminating old medical equipment and faded wallpaper. No one was there. He pressed on, determined to finish the job. By the time he reached the fourth marked room, the whispers had grown louder, a chorus of indistinct voices following him. The room was an old operating theater. The metal table in the center rusted and stained. As he lifted his camera, the temperature dropped sharply, and his breath clouded the air. Get out, the voices hissed, louder now. Evan snapped the photo and bolted, deciding to skip the rest of the rooms. He raced back to the entrance, his footsteps pounding against the floor. When he reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. He yanked and kicked at it, but it remained sealed shut. Then, from the darkness behind him, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He turned, his flashlight flickering. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, a woman in a hospital gown, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Who's there? Evan shouted, his voice cracking. The woman didn't answer. She began to move toward him, her steps uneven but unnervingly fast. Evan stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. He grabbed his camera and snapped a photo, hoping the flash would scare her off. When the light illuminated the hallway, she was gone. But then the whispers returned, deafening now, echoing from every direction. He turned back to the door and found it wide open. Without hesitation, he ran out, sprinting to his car. Once inside, he locked the doors and glanced at the asylum. The front door was closed again, and the flickering light above it had gone out. Evan sped home, his hands shaking. When he finally reviewed the photos on his computer, his stomach dropped. In each image, there were figures, faint, ghostly shapes that hadn't been there when he took the shots. In the therapy room, a man stood in the corner, his face obscured. In the operating theater, a shadowy figure loomed over the table. But it was the final photo that made his blood run cold. The hallway where he'd seen the woman was filled with faces, dozens of them staring directly at the camera, their mouths open in silent screams. A notification popped up on his screen, an email from the client. Thank you for your work. Payment has been sent. Do not return to the asylum. Do not share the photos. Delete them immediately. Evan deleted the email and shut off his computer. But that night, as he lay in bed, he swore he heard whispers. And when he checked his camera the next morning, the photos were back. The Craigslist ad was enticing. Dog sitter needed. $500 per night. Urgent. House located in rural area. Must be comfortable staying alone overnight. Mara was saving for a trip abroad, and this seemed like easy money. She loved dogs, didn't mind solitude, and figured it was a straightforward job. She replied to the ad and received an address along with instructions. Arrive by 8 p.m. Feed the dog before 9 p.m. Lock all doors and windows by 10 p.m. Do not let the dog outside after midnight under any circumstances. Mara chuckled at the ominous tone, but agreed. When she arrived, the house was isolated, nestled deep in the woods. It was larger than she expected, with an old Victorian charm. The man who greeted her was polite but visibly anxious. His eyes darted around as he handed her the keys and a small, handwritten note of the rules. The dog's name is Shadow, he said, gesturing toward a sleek black Labrador sitting by the fireplace. He's well behaved, but you need to follow the instructions, especially the last one. Mara smiled. Got it. Anything else I should know? The man hesitated, then shook his head. Just don't open the door after midnight, for any reason. He left quickly, leaving Mara alone with Shadow. The evening started pleasantly enough. Shadow was friendly and playful, following Mara around as she explored the house. By 8:30, she had fed him, locked all the doors and windows, and settled on the couch with a book. At 11:45, Shadow's ears perked up. He stood, his body tense, and stared at the front door. "What's wrong, boy?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Shadow let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the door. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Mara froze, the man's warning ringing in her ears. "Do not open the door after midnight." The knocks came again, louder this time. "Hello?" A voice called from the other side. It was a woman's voice, soft and trembling. "Please. I need help. I'm lost." Shadow barked, a deep, guttural sound that made Mara's chest tighten. "Go away," she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. The voice became more desperate. "Please, I'm so cold. Let me in." Mara checked her phone. It was 12:03 a.m. The knocking stopped, but Shadow didn't relax. He stayed by the door, growling softly, his body a rigid line of tension. Then she heard it, a faint scratching at the back door. Her heart raced as she tiptoed to the kitchen. The back door was locked, but the sound of nails scraping against the wood sent shivers down her spine. "Let me in," the voice said again, now at the back door. It was still soft, but there was something off about it, something hollow and wrong. Shadow growled louder, his hackles raised. Mara grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and backed into the living room. The house felt colder now, the air heavy and oppressive. At 12:30, the voice returned to the front door. "You can't keep me out," it whispered. "I know you're in there." The doorknob rattled, and Shadow barked ferociously, lunging toward the door. Mara clutched the knife, her hands trembling. "Go away." The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that made her stomach churn. The rattling stopped, and silence fell. For the next hour, Mara sat on the couch, gripping the knife, her eyes darting between the front and back doors. Shadow stayed by her side, his growls fading into occasional whimpers. At 2 a.m., she thought it was over. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, circling the house. Mara peeked through the curtains, but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped directly outside the living room window. She held her breath, her eyes locked on the glass. A face appeared, pale and distorted, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Mara screamed, stumbling backward. Shadow barked wildly, positioning himself between her and the window. The face pressed closer, its features stretching unnaturally as it grinned. "You should have let me in," it whispered. Shadow lunged at the window, and the face vanished. Mara didn't sleep the rest of the night. She sat with her back to the wall, clutching the knife, as Shadow stayed vigilant by her side. When dawn broke, the oppressive feeling lifted, and the house felt normal again. At 8 a.m., the man returned. His face was pale, and he avoided looking directly at her. "Did you follow the rules?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Mara said, her voice shaky. What was that thing?" The man didn't answer. He handed her the money and said, "Thank you for staying. I'll handle the rest." Mara left without pressing further, vowing never to take a Craigslist job again. But later that night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You should have let me in." The Craigslist ad was cryptic. Looking for a travel companion. Must be okay with long drives. Generous pay. Serious inquiries only. Mason had been laid off and was desperate for cash. A road trip sounded like an easy gig, and the promise of generous pay sealed the deal. He replied, and within minutes he got a response. "Meet at the Pine Rest stop on Highway 46 at 10 p.m. tonight. You'll know my car." When Mason arrived, the rest stop was nearly deserted, then shrouded in darkness. He scanned the lot until he spotted a black SUV with tinted windows parked in the far corner. The driver's window rolled down as he approached. Inside was a man in his 40s, clean-shaven, with piercing blue eyes and an unsettlingly calm demeanor. "You're Mason?" the man asked. "Yeah, that's me." "Good. Hop in." Mason hesitated for a moment, but reminded himself of the money and climbed into the passenger seat. The man introduced himself as Victor and handed Mason an envelope. Inside was $500 in cash. "Half now, half when we're done," Victor said. "Just keep me company and help me stay awake. No questions, and don't fall asleep." "Sure," Mason said, pocketing the cash. "Where are we going?" Victor smiled faintly. "We'll know when we get there." The answer was odd, but Mason shrugged it off. The drive started uneventfully, with Victor keeping the radio off and the car eerily silent. And hence Mason tried to make small talk, but Victor's responses were short and vague. As the hours passed, they left the populated areas behind and entered a desolate stretch of highway. The trees lining the road grew thicker, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Around midnight, Mason noticed something strange. They had passed the same broken-down billboard 3 times. "Hey," Mason said, trying to sound casual. "I think we're going in circles." Victor didn't respond. "Did you hear me?" Mason pressed. Victor's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We're not going in circles." Mason decided not to argue, but unease settled in his chest. At 1 a.m., Victor pulled over at the side of the road and cut the engine. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Where are you going?" Victor didn't answer. He stepped out of the car and walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Mason sat in the car, the silence now oppressive. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. "Victor," he called, his voice shaky. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No wind, no animals, just an endless, suffocating stillness. He followed a faint path into the trees, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. After walking for what felt like forever, he spotted something ahead, a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a pit. Mason approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The pit was deep, its sides lined with stone, and at the bottom was something wrapped in black plastic. A faint rustling sound came from the pit, followed by a low, guttural growl. Mason. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating Victor standing behind him. His face was pale, his eyes darker than before. What is that?" Mason stammered, pointing to the pit. Victor tilted his head. "You shouldn't have followed me." Mason took a step back, but Victor advanced, his movements unnaturally smooth. "People like you never listen," Victor said, his voice now layered with something guttural, something inhuman. Mason turned and ran, crashing through the trees, his flashlight bouncing wildly. He could hear Victor's footsteps behind him, fast, relentless. When he reached the car, he dove into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and he sped off, his hands shaking on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the road was empty. Victor was gone, or so he thought. As he drove, he noticed something in the passenger seat, a black envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was him, standing at the edge of the pit, taken from behind. At the bottom of the photo were 4 words scrawled in red ink. "You can't escape me."